Thank you so much, David and Amanda. I think it would be appropriate to test the gut reactions of the audience in this case. I have some questions of my own. I'd first like to open up to the audience and see who has questions or comments for our two speakers.
I was wondering if maybe you guys could each sort of respond to each other in terms of reconciling David, your theory of this kind of medium sympathetic spectator and this idea of the technocratic tragic image, which, Amanda, if you could expand on that a little bit, would also really help me understand what you were elaborating on. Yeah.
It would be great if you could elaborate on the question a little bit.
Yeah, it's a really general prompt, but I guess I'm wondering whether you see whether these two sort of paradigms, one of the image itself and one of our interaction with the image, whether they're incompatible or compatible, or how they might commingle.
I'm just looking at my notes on your talk.
One could also ask whether David is water on Amanda's mills.
I don't necessarily. I think I agree with pretty much everything Amanda said about. I think we may have been talking about such different phenomena that they may not actually. I mean, so therefore they're compatible. Well, but Amanda might disagree.
I'm going to try and speak. So, sorry. One thing I found really interesting about what you were saying, David, was the relationship between the image and the measure, and the operations of the image as a measure.
Yeah.
And you talked about that as a shifting phenomena over and through movies, and whether we, as the measure of the image is to assess our morality or our ability to be human or non-human, is really engaging. And then you move to the image of Michael Douglas in The Game, where the measure of the image is so fully economized in the experience economy of images that no longer is the image in the surface of financial capital in terms of assessing the sweat on the hand and so on, but the image is an embedded moment of capital, techno-capital, and financialism. So in that world of the image is always measuring. It's always as an aspect of law, and that law doesn't have a moral axis anymore. And I found that really in keeping with some of the ideas that I'm trying to think about, that don't try and theorize the image with a due moral process of, let's say, the principle of freedom that demands a kind of moral axis of the image. And I think where you end up is of course, a very scary place, and a violent place. And I think I end up in a very violent place as well, with this destruction of moral certitude in terms of it being a measure for the image.
No, I think that's, yeah. Did you all hear that? Yeah. I think also one shift of weight I was trying to think about was just sort of exactly what Amanda said. What happens if you think of the image as a diagnostic of your moral health? And it isn't, again, it's, to avoid the kind of certitudes that we're being asked to avoid. It's not, it's not the image that's making those claims either. It's actually, we insist on continuing to diagnose our relationship to images as, as a measure of moral fitness, which ultimately turns everything into a laboratory, which again reinscribes this kind of testing situation of you can actually arrive at a truth or a moral bedrock. I mean, I find myself queasy without it, but...
I just wanted to ask both of you about comedy, because we were, of course, laughing at a lot of the imagery that you showed us, David. There's a sense that in this context, we can laugh. And in the cinema, we also will laugh at certain moments. And also I wanted to, and in terms of Amanda's paper, this concept of the non-tragic obviously invites the question of the relationship, the dialectic of the comic and the tragic within theatre. But you both appear to be talking about a condition beyond the frame of the theatre as such, but still theatre without theatre, a kind of baroque is what I'm interested in asking you about, and what your reflections on the relationship to the sort of integral baroque character of capitalism. And capitalism is necessarily baroque because it must constantly exceed a measure in order to produce surplus, which is one definition of the baroque, that it's an exceeding of the frame, as it were. Except that, of course, in traditional notions of the baroque, you always have that dialectical relationship with the constraint of the frame. There's an excess which is represented or depicted, but it's always in relation. You know it's an excess. It's signaled as an excess because you know what the frame is, whereas you both appear to be pushing towards questions of, operating without frames. So it's a kind of ultra-baroque or sort of something like that.
Okay, thanks. I'll just say something. I was really, in my paper, I was really interested in how artworks had tried to stop or delete the problem of representation from their method, their operation, by involving themselves in the apparatus of the image rather than the representational claim of the image. And of course I argued that by involving themselves in the apparatus or the system or the basis, the base mechanic or the machine of the image, the substrate, that these artworks accidentally or naively invited theatre. So my argument would be that if we think about the relationship between theatre and representation, then as I've argued, we don't escape representation, like we live with mediation. But I wanted to think about how mediation was always already part of our relationship with the image, and that we weren't gonna try to naively delete it. So I wanted to think about a life with theatre that didn't have theatre as a frame. And I think it's something like what you're describing. But it's certainly an attempt to not assume that we can be Platonists here. It's a non-Platonic discussion.
Doesn't the Douglas Gordon piece that we were talking about a second ago exemplify exactly that strand of production that you've been describing, or does it transcend that?
I think that the Douglas Gordon is slightly problematic. For me, it's kind of exciting and fun to watch. more like brackage. The very thing I was kind of criticising for being idealistic about the material of the camera as another gesture towards or this irony about representation, because it attempts to treat everything as if it's physical material. It seems so physicalist. I'm not quite sure how its operations pan out with its reference to cinema itself. I find that a little bit cliche, and it's enjoyable in many ways because it's cliche, but I find it a little bit easy, like a joke.
I mean, there is one sense in which it's a joke. I think the reason I'm so kind of fascinated, I mean, I saw it years and years and years ago in an exhibition, and I remembered it again when I was working on this, because there's two key elements to this thing, and I think it really, how you take that movie sort of depends on which element hits you first. In the same way that I often just reject a lot of what is probably very good performance work out of hand because I'm thinking about it from one point of view when I should be thinking about it from another point of view. In this case, or not should, but other people would see it another way. When I'm not being recorded, I'll be happy to tell you who I'm thinking of. But in this case, yeah, there's a structural principle, there's a structuralist cinema principle to it, which is the film, or the DV film as material quantity, the camera as material, it's getting kicked around. So yes, there is an exposure of the apparatus kind of move, but that's not the one I hit first. The one I hit first was actually, this movie revealed to me how deeply moved I was by what seems to be the last scene of Terminator 2, and I hadn't realized what an effect it had on me until I saw this movie, which is, when he's getting the crap kicked out of him by the silvery dude. And finally, as he's lying there, you go to his point of view. And it starts breaking up into bits and bytes because he is, after all, a computer, and he's had a beam rammed into his chest and he's been impaled. And his pixels just his optical whatever starts undergoing pixel death, and that's it for him. I mean, then he revives. But it became a kind of, in the same way that Alien, sort of drooling on your shoulder became iconic in horror movies after that, this notion of the robot dying became iconic in a certain way. So what I find incredibly peculiar about that movie is that I find myself feeling horrible for the camera. And I find myself, and yeah, it's a cute pun on the one hand, but my awareness that it's a cute pun doesn't seem to remonstrate adequately against the fact that I keep feeling terrible for the camera, and I cannot help identifying with this poor dying camera as victim, even though it is only a camera. So the film keeps showing me, and so maybe this is only a great work of art if you are naive and raised on a certain level of crap movie, and I'm totally conceding that possibility, but it also seems to point towards a way out if you take it this way, if you take it, if you will, affectively. It seems to point to a way out of a spectator, of an observed observer, a spectator-performer dialectic. It gives you a way out of this frame because there's nobody on one end of it. There is just the apparatus that hitherto had served the dialectic, and now this other thing is a ghost. So it seems like rather than running around in a circle the whole time, you've actually got a way out to something that you can't quite theorize yet, which is what I found so interesting about it. It becomes, now you have, the medium is generally understood to be the thing that we don't have sympathy for, that we will not have any kind of emotive reaction to, right? We can talk about the victim, we can talk about the subject of human rights, we can talk, as mediated through the image, we can talk about the observer. I have never even thought about having sympathy for the actual camera. And this is the position that this movie keeps putting me in over and over. And that to me seems, I don't know where it goes, and it probably just leads to another technocratic dead end. But for the moment, I find it kind of something worth trying to follow up on somehow.
I just wanted to add a footnote to what you were saying, that the drama that invites you to empathize with the camera unfolds. Well, it's between the artist's sneaker and the camera itself. And I know I once had an art student called Matthew Grover who did a remake of this piece where he left the the cap on, so you didn't see the camera being kicked around. And there it really was strictly the apparatus that was slowly unfolding, and the film was just kind of falling apart. And I guess that would be a more clean exemplification of what Amanda was pointing to, perhaps. There was a question, I think Rosalind wanted to.
Thank you. I have a question for each of you. I don't know whether, I'll start with Amanda. I'm sorry to make you talk. So toward the beginning of your talk, you critique. You criticize the critical image and the critique of representation, although you didn't use that term, because you say that they're implicated in the very power they're criticizing. Is that a fair summary of what you said? Yes, okay. So I'm wondering if your assessment would change if you had a more differentiated notion of power, rather than power as something monolithic, that there are different kinds of power. For example, there's authoritarian power and there's democratic power. So, authoritarian power making reference to objective grounds or foundations for the truths it promulgates, and democratic power withdrawing those foundations and therefore not foreclosing debate.
Thanks for your question. One, just to kind of tidy up some of the things I was kind of complaining about. It wasn't just the fact that these critiques resulted in a kind of irony where the power they were criticising, they were also implicated within. It was also, that was just one aspect, because what I was really interested in was when these practices did not try to criticise a power, and instead of identifying a power as a monolithic condition, and trying to expose it, like a Brechtian critique, for example, that would try to unmask the false nature of power.
That's a particular notion that's a particular notion of critique, but it's not all critique.
No. So the other forms of critique I would examine in this paper would be when, say, with Stan Brakhage, he wasn't interested in exposing or revealing a power in his work through that process. So, in other words, the very condition of his work as a critical kind of method would be simply to say, I will deny representational method in my work, and try and think about some kind of access to the apparatus of the image itself. And I was really interested in art practices that didn't attempt to undermine our power in a specific sense, but instead understood their authority or their claim is to access something like the real of the image itself. And so I found that these practices, they didn't, as I said in my paper, they didn't want to highlight a future to come. They didn't want to highlight the evils of the powers that be. They were much more interested in thinking about the flow and systems of existing forms of image experience and exchange. different understanding of what power is, but they all have a very common understanding of what freedom is. And it was their understanding of freedom that I think debilitates their critique, not their understanding of power. So I hope that makes it more clear.
Yes, but I still think that there are other definitions of critique other than the traditional notion of critique as unveiling a real. So even somebody like Foucault's definition of critique as giving oneself the right to, giving the subject the right to question power on its effects of truth, and truth on its effects of power, or something like that, might even be a freedom not just to come, but some kind of exercise of freedom, in the sense of like that kind of critique is itself a declaration of rights.
As in my paper, I was trying to think about the problem of the principle of freedom as being unquestioned in these art practices, that it was a bedrock rather than something that was actually the subject of critique itself. So for me, and as an artist, I think it's really important that my work is critical, and I would not give up on the term critique at all for my artwork. Mm-hmm. It's just that I think that we need to have a very interrogative questioning of the comprehension of critique now.
I totally agree
in light
with that.
of these
Yes.
formations.
Mm-hmm. And then with David, I just want, mine's not really a question, but I mean, I was thinking you were going to go somewhere else with this, which is the direction that it could be taken, like when you were talking about these films that test the moral fitness of the spectator, you know, Clockwork Orange and Parallax View. I thought you were going to raise a challenge to the underlying assumption of so much discourse about images and of violence in relation to the spectator, which I think often assume that, have an uncomplicated view of the spectatorial subject as morally fit, actually, that he or she is going to get nauseated by seeing violence, or he or she is going to empathize, right? Rather than the fact that we are extremely complex subjects who are capable of sadistic responses, etc. So that was, I thought that was really fascinating, that testing of the moral fitness of the spectator.
Yeah, I mean, I think but a lot of the work that I do winds up thinking about spectatorship or experimenting with spectatorship in one form or another. And when I was invited to do this, I was struck by the different ways that different disciplines treat the problem of spectating violence, right? Which is to say that some of the best, most inspiring work that of what little I know of human rights, of sort of human rights and image theory, so Human Rights in Camera or The Civil Contract. These books do a really convincing job of theorizing a way in, the basic problem of engagement, the problem of engagement or disengagement with these images. And they both do a great job of arguing why a practical immediate engagement is not necessarily, or an immediate effect of moral revulsion is not necessarily, the lack of that is not necessarily disqualifying in terms of what work these images do. Then you switch over to film theory, cinematic theory, which really focuses incredibly hard, on the problem of violence, of spectating violence, and it's either sort of psycho or neurocinematics that are sort of really focusing on editing rates and montage rates and heartbeats, or it will be a kind of apparatus theory or identification. And yet the basic question that these are fictional, there seems to be very little overlap between these super aggressive ways of thinking about violence when watching fiction films. Don't actually you wind up with a totally different set of disciplines which involve more electronic media theory and human rights and image theory applied to documentary images. And it's a totally different, but what's interesting is that this comes from two totally different ways about thinking about a subject. And it seems like in film theory, the subject one way or the other winds up being, ferociously embodied, either because you're referring to a drive psychology or because you're really going straight for their neurons, right? Whereas you have a more abstract, reasonable, and you posit a more abstract, reasonable, and untouched observer in relation to war photography, say, precisely because these images make a greater demand on you. And in a way, it would almost seem, I kind of felt a little weird talking this much about the spectator when the urgency is all on the side of what is being taken, of what is being photographed. So that's where I sort of got interested, because in A Clockwork Orange, you're really seeing somebody who is themselves being subjected to violence as a spectator in the most literal possible way. And then what do you do with that? So that's where this all started. So then thinking about how you could think of viewing an image, of sort of trying to merge these points of view in a broad sense by actually thinking of the situation of looking at the image as being in a laboratory. And in both of these movies, you actually had a physical screening room to do that in, and that's where that's sort of where it was going from.
Yeah, I don't think it's an ethical problem to focus on the spectator, rather than what's being, because I think the bigger problem is that so much of this discourse encourages us to think that we are the victim rather than that we are also perpetrators. And I feel like if we don't identify with the perpetrator, I don't mean in the sense of wanting to be that or assuming that image, but if we don't see ourselves as perpetrators, that we're not going to get anywhere in dealing with the problem of, bringing about a less violent world.
But the question is, and this is the question that sort of comes up again and again, is what does an image tell you about being a perpetrator, about your own responsibility in this, and what is actionable in an image?
I think it depends on the image.
Right, well, fair enough.
Sorry. I congratulate ourselves on putting you together, because I think the papers are very complimentary. So that's the first thing I need to get out of the way. And I thought where the complimentary was that both presentations were about the force of the image, right? Which was, I think, Amanda's formulation, but obviously around in David's. And in two senses: one, that it's about the force that an image has, which would sort of characterize David's paper, but it's also maybe that the forces that images are subject to. So in both senses. And what I find interesting about that is the complete shift away from a thinking about spectatorship in terms of Debordian society of the spectacle, which would get out of the victim of the image problematic. So both of you seem to be suggesting something outside of that Debordian critique, which is a kind of Marxist-inspired critique. And what I found interesting about the films you were showing, the Parallax View and Clockwork Orange, was they're within about 10, 15 years of the Debord book. And certainly its translation in the early 70s, I think. But what I want to pick up on, well, two things. One, in relation to the brief discussion around rights, law, and morality earlier on, was that the referent of rights would not be something like law as a juridical, legislative, rational process. It would be, I think in both of your presentations, the reference subject is a moral subject, but a morality that's organized through physiological sentiment, physiologically demonstrated sentiment, say. I think it's around in your discussion of affect, in reference to Eric's paper, and I wonder if it's around in Amanda's paper through a notion of force as the primary action of the image, rather than reason, or the construction of a social social discourse, right? But what I wanted to ask about, in a way, it's the same question to both of you, and therefore slightly differently. It's for David. Where are power hierarchies in the play of images, or in the force of the image that you were describing? So you had a description of sort of bodily physiological reactions to images, but the institutions and situations that reaction, the corporeal affect image nexus happens, is a power hierarchy in every case, right? So there's power is playing out in these reactions, and that, I think, would complicate the identifications you set up. And for Amanda, I'm wondering whether in the situation you leave us with where in a way freedom, this sort of negatively determined freedom, is not the criteria for understanding the effect of the image. Well, what criteria are we left with? What is the economy of the image? What are the terms or parameters for understanding the economy of images and the demands? Because clearly they're operating differently. Not every image is the same, and you I think, agree that not every image then is just flattened out into equivalences of images. So there are clearly differentiations, which may be power differentiations, but I think other kinds as well. And I'm wondering what criteria we're left with if we surrender or give up negatively defined freedom as our term.
I'd like to add that I think Suhail's question to you, Amanda, is important because the way you end your paper, you run the risk of offering another example of these unimaginable futures that you've been critiquing in the practices that you describe. No? I mean, for me too, there was the question of criteria. That was important. I didn't fully understand your question for David, to be honest. I don't know if he did. Could you just simplify, condense it?
Where's power in your analysis?
Where's power in my analysis? You could as easily ask, where's analysis in my analysis? There's a bunch of, I could mark places where power becomes interesting in this setup, right? One is, the films are, on the most literal level, in both cases, the subjects are, Alex is being subjected to state power, and Joe is being subjected to corporate power on a slightly more complicated, because these are the people who are observing them. But paradoxically, and this is what I find so interesting, that whole wiring mechanism, looks like it's going to deliver shocks. And that's what's so strange about it, is that actually it's there to take information. It's actually not there to deliver shocks at all, which is a strange inversion of the relative weights between the image and the spectator in the first place. On a slightly more abstract level, which just complicates it a little bit, and this is one reason why these movies struck me, they have both actually volunteered to be there. Nobody made them. Right? And you can say, in the case of the character in Clockwork Orange, that it's sort of like telling someone interns are willing to work for free, so it's fine. He wants to get out of a mental institution. Who wouldn't volunteer for this? Nonetheless, so there's a certain complicity with power operating at the same time. Now that's just within the movie itself. My jet lag is messing with my train of thought, but I'm trying to get there. They pull a very funny move in Clockwork Orange. You're either watching Alex watch, or you're watching the screen. And if I recall correctly, the screen is in frame, or the actual arc around the screen is in frame, or you're not there long enough for it to be a difference. In the case of Parallax View, there is no frame. You are practically being subjected to a second movie because it's so self-consciously artistic and elaborated. So, in terms of in terms of relations of power that the actual spectators of these actual movies are entering into, those are subtly modified as well. The last thing I would say, and again, this goes back to a sort of allegorical arrangement, is, or two last things I would say, if I can remember them. One is that it's an interesting, I think it emerges from the sort of monstrosities of psychology in the 20th century, especially behaviorism. And their relationship to military technologies like brainwashing, or the suspicion of military technologies like brainwashing. That's where a lot of these visions come from. But the basic situation of an auditorium, and this goes back to your point about the Baroque, and this is probably a commonplace for most of you, is the alignment of one-point perspective with whatever monarch happened to be watching the show. Which is to say, you are sitting, in a Renaissance masque, for instance, which in England was the first form to actually use perspective. The vanishing point is lined up with the king, or duke, or whichever noble the mask is being performed for on these perspective sets. They're sitting on an elevated platform, and so they're the only ones who get a perfect view. And the throne is actually referred to as the state. Right, but this is, you could argue that it's just on the cusp of capitalism. You can argue that it's just on the cusp, of authoritarianism. But what you wind up with, or monarchism. But what you wind up with, is over the intervening 4 or 5 centuries, you wind up with a reversal in which the focal point in the auditorium is actually a victim of the image, instead of the other way around. And that is strange. The last thing I will say in this incredibly long answer, in terms of where is power, in the most practical sense, I went through it very quickly because it's a kind of thinking that everyone is familiar with at this point, which is, every time you click like, you're offering up information. Every time you put on Google Glass, they say they're not tracking your eye motions, but they certainly can. It's voluntary on their part. So it's a commonplace at this point that your entertainments are gathering information about you and that you're volunteering it. And I think applying that perspective backwards to these movies, these movies show it in its earliest, absolutely clumsiest form, this playing out of power, where you need all of these wires and this entire setup, and you still need a theater and all this. And I think there's probably some value in sort of reaching back and finding the incredibly clunky origins to this operation of power in some way.
Hi. The kind of things you're asking in your questions are helpful, the kind of questions that the paper itself asks of itself. And at the end of the paper, I was saying that, this position might lead to someone saying, oh, well, that's just passive. That's just, you just leave power, existing power remains unquestioned and just gets relativized into this deontologized space. So I can see where your questions are coming from, because they're the kind of questions that I'm also asking of this critique. But I'll also say, dear Dad, when you said that the position at the end of the paper might risk asking for the same kind of imagination that freedom asks of us. I think you said something like that. My problem really is that this principle of freedom doesn't ask anything of our imagination whatsoever, because it's a negatively organized concept of freedom. It's about unfreedom. So And even if we had it, we wouldn't know it because we'd be so busy complaining about it as being unfree. So my point is that these critiques are not imaginative, but neither are they logical. They are contradictory. So what, perhaps in response to your question, Suhail, my answer would have to be, without the referent of freedom or unfreedom as our primary centre of critique, I would propose anyway, that logic can help us. I would also say that turning to logic or a theory of non-contradiction would allow us the imagination that we thought we had but we haven't actually got, and would allow us to speculate with greater risk through logic. Now, I don't know whether that means that we have a kind of Larawellian situation where we're waiting for the evolutionary degrowth of freedom that would just happen without us, if you like. I'm not quite sure how freedom would play out in that scenario, but it's something that I'm really excited about. And I don't know whether, like Larawell, I would have to be compelled to, for example, take equality as my parameter that he would argue would fit much more with this scientific or logical understanding of speculation for a politics. So I don't know whether I agree with Larawell or not on that, but it's something that is there as a kind of response to your question, and it's something that I'm trying to think through. So I hope that's okay in answering your question.
I think that in view of both the published timeline and in view of Amanda's vocal cords, we should let her off. And thank you very much to both of you. We will reconvene at 4:30 for Sharon Slavinsky. See you then. Thank you. Thank you.